Welcome. This is Jim Gasparini, Vice President of the Institute for Historical Study, and welcome to our August 2024 Midsummer presentation. Today's presenter is Peter Meyerhof, and let's see. Yes, Peter has doctorates in both cell biology and dentistry, but researching the history of Northern California is what has occupied his free time over the past 30 years. He has received awards for his original research on a variety of historical topics. He has published some of his work over this period and, now retired, plans to research and publish much more. He has been active in the Institute for Historical Study for over 10 years and has shared his work before. Using photographs, oral stories, and historical documents, Peter will weave the stories of individual Chinese residents into the history of events that shaped their life in a small rural valley. But actually, I should have said before, do we have a volunteer to take notes for this presentation and write it up for the newsletter? Don't all speak at once.
I can do that, Jim.
Great, thank you. Okay.
I'd be happy to help with if there's any editing required.
And the recording, I'll make the recording available as soon as I can. Okay, Peter, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, and thank you everybody for showing up this afternoon. Let me see if I can get into the first slide here. Of course. Oh, here we go. Share. There we go. Okay, well, today we'll look at the forgotten history of the early Chinese who lived in the Sonoma Valley. And I want to go beyond the stereotypes of nameless Oriental men and look into the lives of many individuals whose identities and stories have been preserved. Now, as you know, there's a lot that's been written about the early Chinese of San Francisco. And also there's been a fair amount written on the Chinese of the Napa Valley, Petaluma, and Santa Rosa, but there's next to nothing written on the Chinese of small rural communities, such as the Sonoma Valley in the 19th century. Now, very soon after the American conquest, already before the gold rush, the idea arose to bring Chinese goods and workers into California. So we can read a letter, for instance, from the San Francisco merchant Charles Gillespie to the American consul Thomas Larkin in Monterey on March the 6th, 1848. Gillespie had just returned from China with his family and with 2 Chinese men and a woman who would have been among the very first in San Francisco. And Gillespie wrote, quote, "One of my favorite projects is to introduce Chinese immigrants into this country. Any number of mechanics, agriculturalists, and servants can be obtained. They would be willing to sell their services for a certain period to pay their passage across the Pacific. The Chinese are a sober and industrious people, and if a large number could be introduced into California, landed property would increase in value 4-fold. Now, Larkin, who was California's most prominent businessman at the time, sat on this idea for several months. Then early in 1849, Larkin and his business partner, Jacob Lease of Sonoma, purchased a ship, the Evelyn, to send to China with over 3,000 ounces of placer gold. The Evelyn left Monterey in February with Lease on board and arrived at Hong Kong in May. The cargo sent back was described as the richest and most valuable cargo of Chinese ever brought to this market. Among the pieces shipped back on the Evelyn to Lease's brother-in-law, General Vallejo of Sonoma, were these 2 pieces of silverware recently identified by their hallmarks as being manufactured in Hong Kong and shipped back to Sonoma. But we can also read in the manifest of the return trip, there were two Chinese men. They were almost certainly the very first to come to Sonoma. Contracts were signed in Hong Kong between Jacob Leese and these two individuals named 𝘊𝘢𝘭𝑺 and 𝘊𝘢𝘭𝑺 in July of 1849. They both agreed to come to California for 3 years. 𝘊𝘢𝘭𝑺 agreed to work as a tailor and 𝘊𝘢𝘭𝑺 as a cook. Leese agreed to provide them with lodging and food, as well as a salary of $15 per month for 3 years. A similar contract was made a week later between Leese and a Chinese laborer. He would sail on a subsequent ship and work for 3 years as a so-called coolie. He was promised $12 per month for 3 years. Now, after their arrival in California, we lose track of these particular Chinese immigrants with the Sonoma connection. Certainly, witnessing the abundance of gold nuggets Jacob Leese brought with him for payments would have been proof to other Chinese that rumors of enormous gold deposits in California were indeed true. Chinese began to come to California in greater numbers from the Guangdong province, formerly known as Canton, in southern China. It included Hong Kong. Some of the laborers were skilled and educated, and others were not. There were incentives to immigration. This was a time of wars, floods, civil unrest, and famine in Guangdong. They were seeking opportunity elsewhere after the Opium Wars, in which about 2,000 Chinese died, but especially after the Taiping Rebellion, which began in 1850 and led to the deaths of approximately 20 million people. And California did indeed need more workers, especially as a flood of Californians abandoned their employers and headed to the gold fields. Immigrants from China still faced the obstacle of the cost of passage, so a credit ticket system arose. A ticket to California was advanced to them if they agreed to pay back this debt out of future earnings. These immigrants could now choose where and how long to work in California. There was a young Chinese man and his wife who took advantage of the credit ticket system in late 1849, bound for California, the mother lode. But on the voyage, the husband became seriously ill and died. The young widow by the name of 𝘊𝘭𝑺, also referred to as 𝘊𝘢𝘭𝑺, had no money upon arrival in San Francisco. Of the 40,000 immigrants who arrived that year, only a few hundred were Chinese, and of these there were probably less than 3 or 4 women. Certainly many more would emigrate in the following years. Now, 𝘊𝘭𝑺 was almost certainly the first Chinese woman to live in Sonoma, even if only briefly. We can read in the marriage registry signed by the Sonoma judge, "I hereby certify that on May the 15th, 1850, I joined in lawful wedlock Henry Conrad of Sonoma and 𝘊𝘭𝑺, a Chinese lady now of Sonoma." And we can also read in the Alta California of San Francisco newspaper, married in Sonoma on 6th instant, Henry Conrad to the well-known China woman 𝘊𝘭𝑺 of Hong Kong. And why was she well known in San Francisco? It was because she had become a San Francisco madam. She was about 20 years old and had already been arrested in San Francisco the previous year as a public nuisance. Henry Conrad, on the other hand, was a respectable man who had come to Sonoma with the New York Regiment in April of 1847. He continued to live in Sonoma and was even elected mayor several years later. 𝘊𝘭𝑺 clearly did not live in Sonoma very long. Just a few months after their marriage, she was back in San Francisco and running one of the earliest and most successful brothels in the city. Prostitution was legal in San Francisco until 1854, but this didn't stop her from continuing as a madam for many years after. It became illegal to bring any Asian woman to America unless there was proof that she was, quote, of correct habits and of good character, according to the 1869 Statutes of California. Chinese women would remain a novelty in Sonoma. Only the wealthy Chinese merchants were, in fact, allowed to bring their wife and family. The census tells us there were around 500 Chinese in California in 1850, but by 1852, there were over 25,000, most coming through San Francisco and heading straight to the gold fields. The Chinese were aliens ineligible for citizenship. Therefore, they could not vote, they could not hold office, or even own land. As early as 1848, Chinese labor was praised as the answer to affordable farming in California. And by 1851, there are records of Chinese working in the Sonoma Valley planting grapevines. William McPherson Hill was perhaps the first to employ Chinese labor to plant 4,000 vines that year in the Eldridge area, which is just northwest of Sonoma. Many of the workers were no doubt disillusioned gold miners looking for more predictable work. By 1857, there were large numbers of Chinese workers in the vineyards of Glen Ellen, north of Sonoma, and also east of Sonoma. They probably constituted more than 200 out of a total population then of about 1,000 people in the valley. Now, there was distrust and bigotry against the Chinese in California from the very beginning. We can read in the California Farmer newspaper published in San Francisco in 1854, quote, "It has been said that Chinese are more ignorant and more depraved than the African race. Admit everything that can be said, and yet we fear no danger that we cannot guard against. California is destined to become a large grower of cotton, rice, tobacco, sugar, tea, and coffee. And where shall the laborers be found? In the South, this is the work of the slave. But California is a free state. Her citizens have spoken it, human progress has uttered it, and God has said it. Then where shall laborers be found? The Chinese. And everything tends to this. That population, educated, schooled, and drilled in the cultivation of these products, they are to be in California what the African has been in the South. This is the decree of the Almighty, and man cannot stop it." Now, assisting the Chinese immigrants was the Chinese Six Companies, later known as the Chinese Benevolent Association. It was an organization with their headquarters in San Francisco, founded in the 1850s to serve the needs of the Chinese immigrants from originally 6 districts in China. It soon offered a major credit ticket system to facilitate immigration, but it also offered the Chinese social services, schools, hospitals. It mediated disputes, and it was empowered to speak for all Chinese in affairs that affected them. In the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, the Chinese continued to come into the Sonoma Valley to work. In 1868, the U.S. signed the Burlingame Treaty with China, which temporarily lifted restrictions on Chinese immigration, ensuring a steady flow of cheap labor into the country. During this time, an estimated 8,000 Chinese entered the country every year. The number peaked around 1880, with 3/4 of all the Chinese in the U.S. living in California. The Chinese in Sonoma Valley were estimated to have reached roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of the total population, far greater than indicated in the census totals. A contemporary estimate in 1886 put the total at 15,000 in Sonoma County. Then the number would steadily drop slowly until about 1920. Now, just about every middle-class family in the Sonoma Valley had a Chinese domestic servant who also served as cook and was generally paid $10 per month, which included room and board. Some lived in a nearby cottage or barn, but most lived inside the house of the employer in what was often a very small closet-like space. The Locust Grove boarding school in Shelbyville, south of Sonoma, employed 2 Chinese cooks by the name of 𝘰𝘰𝘯𝘭𝘺 and 𝘰𝑚 for many years. Local hunters would bring them ducks to cook for the children. The Chinese constituted a very important presence in the valley. During times of relative prosperity, the Chinese found jobs in American-owned businesses, sometimes through friends already here, but often through Chinese-owned employment agencies, such as the 𝘊𝘠𝘭𝘭𝘺 office, located on Spain Street, west of the present-day Sonoma Hotel. During planting and harvesting, the agency could supply more labor as required, tapping into large numbers of Chinese in San Francisco. The agency was very close to the Sonoma Valley Railroad station on the north side of the plaza where many first arrived. Agustin Harassi, often referred to as the father of winemaking in Sonoma, used the employment services of another man, 𝘝𝘠𝘭𝘠𝘮, to hire over 100 Chinese for practically all labor on the huge Buena Vista property. The Watchers family in Agua Caliente, north of Sonoma, employed 20 to 30 Chinese year-round on their large property. The Chinese were everywhere. They were indispensable not only to the wine industry, but to the entire economy of the valley. Carrie Burlingame, Sonoma's longtime booster and preservationist, recalled the 10 Chinese men who worked for her father on his 150 acres of vineyard, orchard, and ranch land in the Boys Hot Springs area, just north of Sonoma, in the late 1880s. Quote, "They were plentiful here, and everybody hired them. They worked from daylight to dusk. They got their own meals and worked for $30 a month. You didn't have to be sitting there watching to see he didn't lay down in the shade. They were the best workers that ever landed in this country." Everyone seemed to agree that the Chinese were extremely reliable, while white workers were not. In spite of working for low pay, they managed to send large sums of money back to China. Here we see a certified check for $165 to be sent from Sonoma to China. The Barris family and their Sonoma Valley Bank were preeminent in these transactions. They were sending so many checks to Asia that they had a set of checks already printed accordingly. Now, on Sunday, which was a day of rest granted to employers, Chinese from throughout the valley would travel to the 4 or 5 Chinese-owned stores around the plaza where they would buy their food for the following week. Burlingame recalled, quote, "They would go to town with their poles on their shoulders and come home with their big loads. They bought white men's clothes to work in, but the minute the evening came along and they relaxed, they would put on their soft shoes, those low shoes the Chinese wear, and they would bathe. People talked about their being dirty, why they always had a fixed-up shower where they would pump water and wash themselves." Now, the ledgers of non-Chinese stores in Sonoma and in Glen Ellen show that they made some purchases throughout the week in these stores too, often including rice and tobacco, but also a wide variety of other products. Their trustworthiness is evident when we see that the merchants often allowed them several weeks to pay with cash or occasionally bartering washing services. Now, the diet of the Chinese was quite varied and healthy. Unlike other workers, they would invariably provide their own food, and this constituted fresh local produce, meat, fish, herbal teas, pickled and dried fruits, rice, barley, vegetables, sauces, and rice wine, with some ingredients imported from Hong Kong. The Chinese pioneer George Breitenbach remembered seeing Chinese when he was a boy, around 1870, at the high-low wash house on First Street West, directly across the street from the middle of the plaza. The Chinese laundry industry was actually a creation that originated in America. and was based on mutual need and opportunity. The high-low laundry building was an old one-story adobe with a frame roof, and it sold provisions to the gold miners in the 1850s. In 1870, 𝘝𝑢𝑭𝑏 was the proprietor of the laundry, and he apparently also conducted an employment office for Chinese labor and a store at that location. The business changed hands many times. Burlingame recalled, quote, "We were a family of 6 people, and we would take our wash once a week to the high-low laundry, and they did it all up for $1, even my father's stiff shirts." Now, farther south on First Street West, there was another Chinese laundry, known as the Hope China House, and later as the Sang Tai Laundry. It served both as a laundry and as a store. It was just south of a blacksmith shop that owned the entire building. There was typically some rivalry between the wash houses. A white observer described in his crude language the activity. He wrote, "There was always 4 to 6 pigtails employed at each institution, and they turned out perfectly beautiful laundry at a very nominal sum. They worked 12 to 15 hours per day. It was great fun to watch them iron with their gigantic 8-pound irons. First, they would spread out the garment on the board, take a sip of water from a bowl, and spew this water in a fine spray all over the piece, and then proceed with the ironing, at the same time keeping up a string of conversation in their Chinese sing-song language." Now, on the southeast corner of Spain Street and First Street East was an old adobe dwelling occupied by the Chinese, and another house farther south. This structure housed the Sang Tai Lung washing and ironing enterprise that advertised in the Shelville Ray newspaper in the 1890s. The owner of the building was Julius Poppy, and he moved and enlarged the structure, now on the northeast corner of Spain Street and First Street West. This is one of those black circles at the top. He intended to enlarge it into a Chinese hotel. He already leased the adjacent 2-story Salvador Vallejo house for a number of years to some Chinese merchants. The store sold trinkets and children's toys. And west of the plaza, on Spain Street, was a large frame building. This is the circle at the upper left. And this was the 𝘌𝘁 Employment Agency and store. Now, stores like this sold not only domestic product goods, but food and herbal medicines imported from China. They also served as banks to hold savings from Chinese, as post offices to collect letters to and from China, as boarding houses, and as meeting places. Further south on Spain Street was yet another Chinese laundry in later years, and still another was operated by Mr. Poi Tong and located on the east side of Broadway, south of the plaza. Sonoma wasn't the only community in the valley to have Chinese laundries. Up in Glen Ellen, there was a laundry run by 𝘌𝘁 around 1900, just east of the Calabasas Creek. Now, with all the Chinese residences and businesses around the plaza, it's not surprising to learn that Chinese New Year was celebrated there, accompanied by plentiful firecrackers late into the night. Carrie Burlingame remembered, quote, "On Chinese New Year, they would bring you presents, silk handkerchiefs, ginger in jars. Oh, how we loved that lovely ginger and syrup and Chinese baskets. We would use them as school baskets sometimes. And candy and lychee nuts. They were so generous on their New Year's. They generally went to town for New Year's and firecrackers. For 3 or 4 days, the town was just blown up with firecrackers." Now, it's been said that because of the relatively small population, Sonoma did not have an exclusively Chinese Chinatown or an actual Joss house or Taoist temple, unlike larger communities in the county. But traditionally, the temple was within a communal house with an altar for Chinese people to go and give thanks, commemorate their ancestors, pray for good health and peace, a way they could relax and converse with others. It was a cultural center where incense was burned and opium pipes were smoked. And there is evidence that a small brick building referred to as the Chinese Smoking House, just south of the 𝘊𝘢𝘺𝘊𝘺 winery, may have been used by the Chinese for this purpose in the late 1890s, before this function was moved to another building on West Spain Street. There was probably a small portable altar known as a 𝘰𝘰𝘮𝘢, as well as an incense burner and a tray made of painted redwood that were used to hold incense sticks for religious ceremonies. In 1938, an expert in Chinese religious artifacts restored such an object as part of a WPA project. She observed the altar was last used at their headquarters near the intersection of Spain Street and 2nd Street West, and was salvaged by the Chamber of Commerce after the building was being razed. Evidence from the 1923 Sanborn map identifies this as the building. It also housed the Sing Tai Laundry, a store, and a residence upstairs. Now, outside Sonoma, there were several hundred Chinese laborers on the ranches and vineyards throughout the valley, with the largest number employed at the Buena Vista winery. They lived in cabins on the hillside just north of the main building. Harry Cutter was the vineyard superintendent, but the employment agent, Ho Ling, was his right-hand man, until about 1865, when the winery collapsed from overspending on an ever-increasing acreage. Po Ling then left the services of Buena Vista and opened a Chinese store in the plaza. Buena Vista first employed Chinese around 1857, when they built the winery and they dug the first wine cellar. They dug another wine cellar in 58 and a third in 1862. Also in 1862, they planted more than 20,000 grapevines. In 1864, the Buena Vista Vinicultural Society boasted, "The vines are managed under a system of extreme simplicity. No staking or training is required, and an extraordinary economy of labor in their cultivation is obtained." They are planted in rows from 3.5 to 4.5 feet apart each way, and are cultivated by Chinese laborers in a manner known as the flat way. In other words, the pruning and harvesting was all on the ground, making this back-breaking work. A witness noted, quote, "It is tedious work because the picker is compelled to squat on his haunches, the grapes seldom being more than a foot or a foot and a half from the ground. The Chinese make good pickers on account of their stolid industry and their genius for plodding." In reality, most non-Chinese laborers would not perform the stoop labor. Even the missions had grown grapevines around a tall central stake. In 1864, the Chinese performed a combined 12,600 days of labor at Buena Vista in every phase of viniculture and winemaking. Needless to say, Colonel Harassi and subsequent owners were strongly opposed to all forms of restriction of Chinese immigration. Almost every vineyard employed Chinese workers. They would be paid $1 a day for 10 to 12 hours. For this $1, they were expected to pick 1,500 pounds of grapes per day at harvest time. During breaks, they generally drank cold tea prepared from boiled water. White men generally were employed to handle the teams of horses. They would be paid $1.50 per hour and provided with room and board. By 1887, the Chinese were getting $1.25 per day, but the whites were now getting $2. The Chinese were involved in less skilled labor throughout the valley, too. On the Jones Ranch near Shelbyville, south of San Francisco, near the bay, in the area known today as China Slough, 160 Chinese laborers were employed to build the levees with shovels and wheelbarrows for the Sonoma Land Company of Shelbyville. They were employed for several years before machinery was finally purchased to complete this back-breaking work of moving mud by hand. And then it would be the white workers who were employed to use the machinery. And in 1878, the Pacific Reclamation Company was formed to reclaim over 10,000 acres of marshland east of the Petaluma River. Again, the Chinese were hired as laborers to build a dike. And again, after thousands of tons of mud were moved by hand, they were dismissed and a floating steam dredge completed the project to reclaim the land where today is Highway 37 from Sears Point to the Petaluma River. But not all Chinese were given subordinate employment. 𝘊𝘢𝘺𝘆 worked in Glen Ellen as a respected winemaker, brandy distiller, and foreman at the Chauvet winery at the turn of the 20th century. At least two other wineries in Sonoma Valley also employed a Chinese foreman in charge of total operations. These included the property of Emil and Julius Dressel, east of Sonoma. Dressel's ranch included 200 acres of vines and a crew of up to 40 workers in 1900. A man by the name of Jia Hen was in charge of running the Dressel Ranch. His Chinese workers slept on wooden boards in a bunk bed in a barracks-type building. It was Jia Hen's crew that performed all the critical grafts on the entire vineyard, grafting varietal shoots to resistant vines so they would not get that 𝘝𝘢𝘭𝑰𝘭𝑚𝘺 mite that destroyed most of the untreated vines. The Chinese performed every other task at the winery too. Chinese were also used for field grafting during the height of the phylloxera period on the Justy Ranch in Glen Ellen and elsewhere. In fact, the Chinese have been credited with saving the entire wine industry from destruction during the phylloxera epidemic of the late 1880s and 90s. But as the years went by, discontent increased among white workers, and there was danger of rioting and arson, as had occurred in Santa Rosa, Petaluma, Healdsburg, and Sebastopol in Sonoma County. Burlingame remembers American men coming to her father's ranch and telling him, "Your barn might burn down one of these days if you keep the Chinese labor. We need work." And in 1877, the Working Men's Party of California was formed by Dennis Kearney and others to protect American workers. The slogan was, "The Chinese must go." The next year, a convention was held to update California's state constitution. The delegates discussed provisions that would forbid the employment of the Chinese, prohibiting them from fishing in Chinese waters and from buying, holding, or even leasing property. However, John Hill, a Glen Ellen grower, explained to Congress in 1877 that Sonoma Valley grape growers depended on Chinese labor. There was another man who stood out in defense of the Chinese, and this was Charles Stewart of Glen Ellen. Like everyone else, he employed the Chinese in his vineyards and had them build his stone house, the Glen Oaks Ranch, that still stands today. Stewart spoke eloquently and said that to include any anti-Chinese clause in the state constitution would be a disgrace to California and beyond the jurisdiction of its laws. On February the 1st, 1879, when the convention brought all the provisions up for final approval, Stewart stated, quote, "These men, after being invited to our shores, after building our railroads, clearing our farms, reclaiming over 1 million acres of our swamp and overflowed land, planting our vineyards and our orchards, reaping the crops of the small and needy farmers, gathering our fruits and berries, digging and sacking our potatoes, supplying our markets with the smaller kinds of fish from the sea, manufacturing our woolen and other goods, cleaning up the tailings of our hydraulic mines, scraping the bedrock of our exhausted mining claims, and relieving most of the householders in this state of the household drudgery, which would be imposed upon our wives and daughters, thus contributing to our happiness and true prosperity. They did the work and did it well, very differently from the tens of thousands of so-called working men with white faces who traveled around from place to place, pretending to seek work, but who had never really worked, do not work, and never will work. Let us not be carried away through blind prejudice, through political ambition, or through race hatred. But unfortunately, Stuart's eloquent words fell on deaf ears and were not taken to heart by the convention. In 1882, Congressman 𝘚𝘰𝘯𝘭𝘭𝘰 of Santa Rosa, just north of the Sonoma Valley area, introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act in Congress in order to protect the American workers against the competition of cheap Chinese labor. The Chinese 6 companies and also large white employers opposed it, but it passed. And it's important to note that this was overwhelmingly a popular opinion. A statewide referendum in California, held in 1879, showed that over 99% of the voters were in favor of ending all Chinese immigration. As jobs became scarcer, anti-Chinese sentiment increased. This was the situation in early 1886. The Sonoma Nonpartisan Anti-Coolie League was established with plans to remove the Chinese by boycotting all businesses where they worked. The Sonoma Index Tribune editor wrote, "The true way to solve the Chinese problem is if we will all withhold from them our patronage and refuse to give them employment. They will soon go away from necessity." One of the county's largest wineries in Glen Ellen fired all their Chinese employees. They swore to only hire white laborers from now on. And in spite of the fact that the editor of the newspaper in Sonoma acknowledged that the Chinese laundries were patronized by almost every family and man in Sonoma and the suburbs, there was a petition circulated in his paper to establish a white labor laundry in place of the 3 Chinese wash houses then operating in Sonoma. As in Napa, no white laundry ever took root because they could not compete with the Chinese economically or in terms of quality and reliability. As the economy suddenly improved just a few months later, announcements by the Anti-Coolie League and the white labor laundry movement faded away. Yet there remained a deep-seated distrust of the Chinese. It did not matter that several Chinese had generously contributed to charitable fundraising efforts, such as this memorial fund. The distrust was based on fear, misunderstanding, and a belief that the Chinese were too different to ever assimilate. Obviously a self-fulfilling fact in light of obstacles placed in their path to integration. In spite of the urging from the Sonoma Anti-Coolie League to avoid violence against the Chinese, Carrie Burlingame recalled, "They were pretty well picked on, and teenage boys used to treat them terribly. They were awfully mean. They would throw rocks at their windows, call them pig-tailed monkeys and all sorts of things, catch hold of their queue and wrench them. They really tormented the Chinese, who were so patient." The Chinese endured this harassment with remarkable patience, but an event occurred in late 1890 that exceeded the limits of endurance. In November of that year, a white customer was shot and killed at the High-Low Laundry. The elderly owner, 𝘠𝘭𝘭𝘭𝘮, was arrested and charged with murder. After being held without bail for over 3 months, there was a trial. It was the very large number of character witnesses who would determine 𝘠𝘭𝘭𝘮's fate. They were a veritable who's who of influential Sonomans who had been loyal customers of 𝘠𝘭𝘭 over many years. One of these 17 character witnesses was 𝘠𝘭𝘭𝘮's landlord, Camille Aguilon. Aguilon was a French immigrant who was a farmer and operated Sonoma's largest winery. All of the character witnesses declared 𝘠𝘭𝘭 was a quiet and peaceable man. In fact, the murder had been precipitated by the victim beating 𝘠𝘭𝘭 mercilessly over a 10-cent discrepancy in his bill. Then another Chinese man had come to 𝘉𝘁's assistance, shot the assailant, and fled. 𝘉𝘁 was found not guilty, but fearing his safety, he headed directly from the courthouse to the anonymity of San Francisco's Chinatown and was heard of no more. The high-low laundry was soon purchased by Charlie Hoy from Oakland. He was a very popular man who, in the words of 𝘰𝘁𝘺, quote, spoke good English and was a good mixer with the white people, as well as being a first-class laundryman. He promoted the laundry with ads in the newspapers. To ease any unpleasant association with the past, he changed the name of the laundry from high-low to 𝘰𝘁𝘳. But maybe in a Freudian slip, he wrote, "Give me a trial." Now, the Exclusion Act was renewed for another 10 years in 1892. It was called the Geary Act. And now most Chinese Americans, native or foreign-born, were required to carry an internal passport or face arrest and deportation. In 1902, Sonoma County Board favored the latest renewal of the law. This time it was to be a permanent law. The diplomatic approach of the Chinese 6 companies failed to achieve results after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was replaced by and large by the Tongs, which adopted a more assertive stance in responding to discrimination and persecution. Unfortunately, the Tongs diversified into organized crime as they became very powerful over the next 40 years. And Tong activity extended into rural areas like the Sonoma Valley. For example, we have the case of Joe Locke, a Sonoma fruit grower. He went into hiding in 1917 after his Tong became involved in several murders of rival Tong members, including one on a Sonoma Valley ranch. At great personal risk, Locke cooperated with local police, and the murder was solved. Now, it's important to realize there were some close personal relationships that developed between the Chinese and the non-Chinese. James Morris operated a ranch in the valley on the site of the Hannah Boys Center and employed many Chinese workers in the late 19th century. His daughter Helen remembers that in the 1890s, there was a Chinese cook who practically raised her after her mother died. 𝘰𝘁𝘺 remembers one Sunday at Buena Vista. The manager's wife socialized with the Chinese in their residential homes on the hillside. She placed her infant son on the arm of 𝘍𝘠𝑙ing's wife, who then sang Chinese songs to him. Carolee Burlingame also remembered how wonderful the Chinese were with children. There were even a few marriages between Chinese and non-Chinese. I've already spoken of Ah Toy and Henry Conrad, but we can also read of the wedding in 1904 of Ah Kay, who was a wealthy Chinese hop grower, and Rosie Hackett, a woman who was half Mexican and half Native American. The civil ceremony was attended by both white people and Chinese. And speaking of Chinese hop growers in this area, there was Ah Sam, who was elected a member of the Sonoma County Hop Growers Association. He attended their meeting in 1891 and was one of the growers who determined the price of hops. In 1888, he was one of the 5 largest hop growers in this district. All this to say, there were some organizations that did willingly integrate the Chinese into their membership, and the Chinese thrived when given the opportunity. Then there was a Chinese boy by the name of John Barris, named for the family of his employer, David Barris, founder of the Sonoma Valley Bank. He worked in the Barris home as a domestic servant and cook from the time he was about 12 years old for almost 80 years. He was considered part of the family, socialized with everybody, and he faithfully maintained the Barris plot in the mountain cemetery. One day he planted some fancy rose bushes there, and on the next visit discovered someone had removed them. He became exceedingly angry when the official cemetery caretaker showed no interest in the theft. Boris yelled at him if a hog was rooting his fodder out of the grave. You still wouldn't do anything. Boris was promptly thrown out of that office. And although it's been written that no Chinese were buried in the cemetery because it was consecrated Christian ground, John Boris died at the age of 90 and was buried there in an expensive and elaborate funeral paid for by Frank Boris, now president of the bank that his father had founded. John Boris was buried in the family plot of his employers that he had so carefully tended. The Boris family was closely tied to the Chinese experience. Frank's cousin Jesse had testified in 𝘊𝘍𝑢𝑠's behalf at his murder trial. Jesse managed the Sonoma Valley Bank that signed the certified checks that the Chinese in Sonoma sent back to China. Frank Boris and his wife adopted two young Chinese girls and had them educated in public school and all the way through high school, which was quite uncommon at that time for any girl. Even after Frank Boris's own death in 1954, there were 4 Chinese still living in the Boris household, serving as caretakers. They lived in a neat little cottage behind the Boris house up to 1970, when the entire property was sold. Today, the Boris house and grounds are known as MacArthur Place Resort in Sonoma. Other than John Boris, very few Chinese were buried in Sonoma. Some were buried in the Chanate County Cemetery in Santa Rosa and in a Chinese section of the Cypress Hill Cemetery in Petaluma. In 1913, the 6 companies exhumed remains from Cypress Hill and shipped them back to China, as was the cultural wish of most of the early Chinese who died in California. Now, between 1905 and 1911, the Chinese laundries on the west side of the plaza closed. The shops and dwellings on Spain Street were already shut down, with the exception of the Sing Tai laundry that would finally close in the mid-1920s. Quang Key's Laundry in Glen Ellen would remain open just a few more years. The average age of the remaining Chinese was now over 60 years, but there was more acceptance of these elderly men in the community. Finally, in 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act, also known as the Magnuson Act, was signed into law on December the 17th, 1943. It allowed the Chinese residents in the United States, most of whom were in California, to become citizens, whether or not they were born here. But it limited Chinese immigration to an annual quota of only 105 new entries per year. And in many states, Chinese Americans, mostly immigrants, but sometimes U.S. citizens, were still denied property ownership rights until the Magnuson Act itself was fully repealed in 1965 with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act. So now, in conclusion, there are several ways Sonoma is considering to commemorate the forgotten Chinese history of the Sonoma Valley. City Council has approved a project to build a ting, which is a tile-roofed pavilion on a knoll in a park. Some of the money has been raised. Another more modest plan of the Historical Society is to place small bronze markers in the sidewalk in front of the known locations of each historic Chinese-occupied structure around the plaza. A third project I'm about to finalize is to place a cemetery marker written in Chinese and in English in Mountain Cemetery to honor John Boris, probably the only Chinese pioneer buried there. But most importantly, Sonoma is commemorating the Chinese by educating others about who they were and how they contributed to our mutual history. Well, thank you very much. I hope you learned something there about this small rural community. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. I have two questions.
Maybe you should stop sharing, Peter.
Okay, sure.
Great, thanks.
There we go.
How did you research this, and what were your sources for your wonderful images?
Well, there's quite a big collection of photographs that has been collected over the years by the Sonoma Valley Historical Society. And I started the project when I came across the newspaper articles about the trial of how at the laundry, and that got me interested not only in that trial and the murder, but the people who participated, you know, how this all came about, and the much larger story. So the little bits and pieces came up all over the place. You know, there's usually one thing leads to another, and that's
So one thing that's sort of conspicuously missing here, and I think I know the reason why, is the voices of the Chinese themselves. I mean, the people you quote from are, you know, of white people who employed them and were their neighbors and so forth. And you know, in a comparable, you know, any other ethnic group, you'd have their grandchildren would have a voice, perhaps, but I imagine there were. Are there any living descendants? And
only very few, because remember, most of them were men who were not allowed to even marry, or were not allowed to bring in wives. It was a very male population, who many of whom died here or went back to China. I'm not aware of any diaries either that were kept by these people of their time here. I know of people have looked for diaries even in China, and it's remarkable how little they left behind in the way of their writings.
mm,
They tended to stay to themselves, and they didn't write down a great deal, as far as I know. There are some descendants of a few who came later, but of the early Chinese, I'm not really aware of any descendants.
mm,
It's unfortunate, but I think the same, you know, the same would apply to other communities which were dominated by a group of single men who really would want it to go home. They sent money home. It was their wish that their bones be sent back to China. So very few were even buried here. Does that answer? I mean,
yes, I mean, I sort of surmised that was the case, but it was interesting to thank you for those details. It's just a reflection of the extreme discrimination of the period.
yes, it's quite unusual how they left with hardly a trace remaining. How there could be that many of them here, and yet they were almost completely forgotten.
Did a lot of those men were they literate? Did they write home?
I think it was a mixed bag, as I understand it. Many were not literate, but there certainly were some who were. That's what I understand. They did send some letters home, I'm sure. I mean, they definitely did. But what became of those letters, I have no idea whether they were preserved.
Yeah. Are you at all planning to follow up with a more modern group of people that maybe came here later, or are you just gonna talk
Yeah,
about?
I have followed up with some. Yeah, I mean, I know of some, I know some personally who came much later in the 70s and later, but uh I don't really, it's a completely different subject that
Yeah,
isn't really, that I'm not that qualified to do.
most of your work is early
Yes,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, the Chinese who came early on.
Or the other people too that you've worked on. It's all kind of 19th century or
Yeah, that's my period.
yeah.
These, most of these Chinese came before the Exclusion Acts, and those are the people I was trying to follow. The people who came very early, and not the people who came much later. There were relatively few immigrants actually who came to the United States during the first half of the 20th century compared to the late 19th century and the most recent, 70 years. That's something else that struck me that I didn't really realize.
How about the paper sons after 1906, destroying all the records, and people were coming from China claiming they were the sons of people who were already living here. Did that bring any new Chinese into Sonoma?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
They were pretty strict rules about anybody coming in, whether they were related or not, really,
Mm.
at that time.
I was just personally struck because, I don't think of Sonoma in a Chinese, like having Chinese people. So it
Right.
was interesting to see what a huge number were there.
Yes, that is interesting. And the same could be said, though, about most communities in this area of the North Bay and also the South Bay. There was a much larger Chinese community in those days in almost every town and village in California, it seems. The Sonoma was not unique at all.
Well, when I was doing my research for Compared to What, which is 1926 about the Pullman Porters in West Oakland, I just this was not a very small detail to me, but I found that most of the laundries were Chinese in
Yes.
West Oakland, in 1926.
Yeah.
And people just all took their laundry to them. So
It was a niche that they filled. And
Peter, where is the support coming from for the structure for the plaza? And do you think it might become a reality?
I hope so.
I mean, that
I-
would really shout out and
Yes.
provide an opportunity for people to begin to
Yes.
know this history.
It's being led by a Chinese immigrant who came in the 1980s to Sonoma. And I believe there's been some support from a San Francisco Chinese group, as well as from private donations in this area.
So there is some local support for it.
Yes, yeah.
Do you have a sense of how popular the idea is, or?
Well, I believe they've raised about half the money, but
Mhm.
the attempt to raise money started about 15 years ago.
Mm,
Most of it was raised at the beginning of that period, and
mm.
it isn't in the news very much anymore, which is unfortunate. Although maybe it'll become a more popular theme in the next year or two, I hope.
Well, I mean, do you have invitations to speak at different places in Sonoma County?
Well, I gave a talk at the community center here in February on something, it was fairly similar to this. There was a little more about Sonoma, specific locations that they would understand better than this audience. And there was a really good turnout. There was about 100 people who showed up. So I was really quite surprised. But nothing, nothing since then. I mean, there have been some discussions I've had with various people who've given me a little more information. But you know, these topics come and go in popularity, I guess. But I believe it's a very important topic that ought to be much better known.
Well, thank you very much, Peter.
You're very welcome.
Any last minute questions before we wrap it up?
Actually, I just want to share some information. The Berkeley Historical Society had an exhibit earlier this year about the Chinese in Berkeley, and it is now online on the Berkeley Historical Society website.
Oh, really?
So, and it covers the period, I mean, the Chinese community in Berkeley from the beginning in 1850, basically, all the way to the present. But there is an overlap with your presentation. So,
yeah, I'll check that.
yeah,
Peter,
thank you.
did you find any evidence of the prostitution ring up there? Or I guess I did some reading at one time on Donaldina Cameron, you know, who was fighting the Chinese prostitution in San Francisco. And I wondered, I just curious whether there was any connection
I
or
haven't found any. I just haven't found any evidence in any of the newspapers I read from this area. I have not come across information.
well,
on that.
yeah.
I was surprised to hear about this, the Chinese madam, given that there were so few Chinese women who came over. Was that, was that different in the city?
I think it might have been a little different in the city because some Chinese women definitely came in as illegal immigrants. I mean, in spite of the law, there were more Chinese women than
They were smuggled in.
There are many people who, yeah, they were either smuggled in or just bribed their way.
Sometimes it was faked, like they were the fake wife of somebody.
Yeah.
But they were, and the whole purpose was just a high-end prostitution.
Yes.
And it numbered in the, I mean, total numbers were in the thousands.
That's amazing.
And she was sort of, Donaldina and her partner, or not a personal partner, but the woman that worked with her, a Chinese woman, rescued something like 2,000 and something themselves in their home, in the home that the building they established there. And so it was a thing. It was definitely a thing. And there was an alley, you might know the name of it, Peter. It goes into Union Square. It's about 2 blocks long, and it has
Maiden
Lane. It's called
Lane,
Maiden Lane.
Yeah.
Because it was prostitutes all along in little, you know, not cabins, but little stalls. And they were mostly Chinese. And so it was a thing. It was a very sad thing in San Francisco. Yeah.
I noticed there's some questions in the chat here. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's nice. Well, thank you for your words.
Okay, then.
Well, thank you.
Very much,
everybody.
Peter.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
for
Peter.
listening.
And
Thank you.
I hope we see some of you back next, or all of you back next month when Susan Breitzer will be presenting Jeopardy Doubled, Racialized Anti-Semitism, Interwar Boundaries in the 1924 Immigration Act. So sort of perhaps another immigration story from 100 years ago.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Peter.
you, Peter.
Thank you.